Welcome back to How the Pros Throw. This is going to be my weekly series whenever there's a tour event, whether it's the Disc Golf Pro Tour or the Go Throw Tour, where I break down some concepts or shots that can help you play disc golf better that I noticed the pros were doing specifically. And as someone who is trying to go pro, these are things that I'm watching for when I'm watching the coverage. So whether you're just getting started and you're getting a little bit nerdy with me, or you have similar ambitions where you also want to get to the Pro Tour, hopefully these videos can help you. Today we're going to be taking a look at the 2025 Cancer Playbook Open, the first ever Go Throw Tour event. These are only 2-round unsanctioned events, but a lot of top pros wins. So I'm going to be breaking down 5 concepts today from this coverage. Last week was the first ever try at this series where I did 10 shots from the Supreme Flight Open, and I got a lot of good feedback from you guys in the comments, so I'm taking a lot of that into account. And I thought a better format that some of you guys suggested would be more conceptual. So these are 5 things that I see people doing that I'll use shots as examples for, rather than just trying to break down 5 or 10 specific shots. And I've set up a secondary camera, hello, way over there, for showing how to do some of these things and how you might be able to implement them better if we need to. Not all of them will need that, but I hope you guys enjoy this series. That being said, let's go ahead and take a look at 5 good concepts from the Cancer Playbook Open, where it was incredibly muddy. Now, I'll first say all this footage is going to be on the Go Throw YouTube channel. It's all live for you to go and check out if you want to watch the full rounds, which I highly recommend. Very entertaining, especially watching people kind of suffer a little bit in the mud. We're going to learn how to not suffer, or how to suffer less if you're playing in muddy conditions today. Definitely go ahead and check out these rounds over on Go Throw's channel. They're also going to have skins and Beat the Pros coming out as well. That being said, the first thing we're going to take a look at is hole 2, round 1. As you're going to see, this is the flyover, and it looks completely different to what it's actually about to look like. Let me up this quality real fast when these guys are putting on this green up here. So if we skip to that, because I do want to take a look at the green first, we're going to talk about how to putt in the mud. And this is Niklas putt from about 60 feet. We're just going to watch this real fast.
To be able to get up and down for par. The level of commitment with that type of shot with a tree right in front of you. Oh my goodness.
And one of the things that it's funny, Luke and Paul's talk about a lot during this coverage. I love their coverage as well. It's very laid back, chill style, very Go Throw style. They talk a lot about how you can't use your legs. And I actually don't fully agree that you can't use your legs. You're not pushing off your legs in the same way. But let's take a quick look at how Niklas made this putt.
Right. You can't use your feet right here. This is all upper body.
Yeah, he doesn't even lift the back foot.
If you try and use the feet, you're just going to slide. Oh, look at it. Try and come out the back as well.
So he's saying you can't use your feet. It's all upper body, which is kind of true. But putting in general is not just an arm and leg movement. There's actually kind of a third thing involved. And let's actually talk about that real fast. Pushing, you think about pulling, you think about squatting, but one that not a lot of people talk about as much is hinging at the hips, where your hips go backwards, and it creates a lot of kind of tension here that you can release. This is what deadlifting is, as well as like good mornings, other movements. And if you watch Niklas, he's not using his feet, but when he's putting, he's still hinging very well. And you'll watch him go down and hinge, and then use a lot of that force in his extension. So you can kind of keep your feet planted and hinge, very similar to kind of a deadlifting movement, and then use your upper body. You're still gonna need very strong upper body mechanics to do this, but he also does a really good job about hinging. And that's actually one of the things I've sort of been practicing. I have a practice basket over here, and then in my backyard, not only doing the weight shift putting, but also hinging. You'll notice this is how Gannon gets a lot of power. And I think it's sneakily how you can get a lot more power than you think. If you watch Ricky putt, he does a very exaggerated version. He drops his arm really low, but this is not where he putts from. He putts from down here because he's hinging the whole time. And so thinking about hinging in your putt being a movement where kind of you almost like you just stick your butt out in a sense. You don't want to smush your low back when you do it, but if you just stick your butt out and then stand up, you're going to notice there's some power there. It's a little awkward to be showing you guys hinging, but when Niklas is putting to get all of that power from that standstill, he's not really pushing off his back foot and forward, but it's much more of a hinged motion. Hinge, and then you don't actually need your feet to putt pretty hard. It wouldn't hurt to mess around with another way to putt, because one of the things that makes disc golf pretty unique is the fact that unlike a sport like golf, which I actually take a lot of inspiration from in my training, and we'll talk about a concept from golf in the second concept that we'll talk about here, because I think it's a pretty important weight transfer concept, especially when you're playing in muddy rounds, so that you don't slip or fall over your brace just in general, even when it's not muddy. But disc golf is pretty different from golf because you're going to find yourself in very varied positions. You're not just doing the same motion over and over again with different clubs with your feet planted into the ground. You're going to have to move your feet. You're going to have to rock a little more. There's going to be weirder ways that you move. So practicing not only putting from a standard weight shift, but also practicing putting from a hinge, like we'll see here. So you can see Niklas right here, hinged in his hips. And then he releases this hinge and extends. And then he does a really good job of holding that fall through on the putt. The upper body stays pretty similar, whether or not you're doing a weight shift putt or a hinge putt. Practice both of them. It's going to feel a little awkward at first. You don't need to fully stick your butt out all the way, but just try kind of bending at the waist and then coming up. Most putters, especially kind of splush putters nowadays, have a sort of hinge because it's a very controllable movement and you're not worried about shifting your weight laterally because your feet can shift under you. But if your feet can stay planted and stable, you can still push off of it, but a mix of pushing and hinging can be pretty helpful. And you can see this as well when Gannon gets up to putt here. He has bad footing.
Two grip issues.
And it's a very similar motion here.
Things are wet.
It's not a weight shift, it's a hinge at the hips. His butt's kind of coming back at us.
Grip it.
And then it goes forward. It's how he's able to keep his feet stable, locked into the ground while generating a lot of power. Concept number 2. And this is the concept that I kind of been teasing from golf, but it is how your weight is shifting. And I think it's a paradigm that we don't really think about the direction that your weight shifts in disc golf very much, but I think it's pretty important. And I recently watched a video from the Titleist Performance Institute, which is a golf thing. There's a lot of cool sensors and things that they're able to do, but they worked with a 2023 US Open champion, Wyndham Clark, and talked about how the weight shifts in the golf swing and how he was doing it incorrectly and how I'm doing it incorrectly. But I also noticed that the players who were doing a good job not slipping were doing this thing as well. I want to look at the players first, and then I'll pull up this concept from the Golf Institute. And the first place that I really saw this was Isaac Robinson's drive on actually the same hole that we're watching putting from. Also, real quick, all this coverage that we're going to be watching today is just going to be the MPO and almost exclusively the league card. I didn't know that the chase card was on Ace Run Pro before I started this, and I just haven't had as much time to watch all of this stuff. It's been a little busy with like dad stuff and just everything in general. And unfortunately, the FPO is not out, but I think it's going to come out on MX Disc Golf. I always like to incorporate both of them because a lot of times FPO is even more applicable to a lot of people's games, but that's not out yet. So let's take a quick look at Isaac Robinson on the tee pad. We're going to see all of these guys do the same thing as they throw and weight shift correctly. But I think Isaac was the most pronounced that I saw. We're going to watch how he shifts his weight here. So his weight is kind of on his back foot, but it's going to transfer up through the foot to the toe. Whoops. And then in a counter-intuitive direction than I would have thought. So his weight now is on this toe moving forward, but you think, oh, it's moving forward this way. That's not really the way that it's moving. It's actually moving forward this way. And you're going to notice that because of how stable his foot is able to hold when it hits the ground. It's in here. And so now he's able to continue pulling through, and you'll notice the weight is here, and now it's kind of rotating around that heel. This is because of this concept that I saw in this Titleist Performance Institute video.
This way? Good. Now, as you start to shallow and weight shift, do you feel like you go this way, or do you feel like you go this way?
Damn, I don't know. I would say when I'm trying to shallow, I feel like I go this way.
I agree. You always have to go this way.
Yeah.
Even when you're shallow.
I think shallowing, I'm not a golf person. I think that's like talking, I don't know, maybe hitting short shots. I'm not a golf guy. I don't really know. But this is something I talked about with my trainer after watching this, who's a strength and conditioning specialist, really good biomechanic guy. And he's like, yes, this is the way, essentially. And this is a very important thing to talk about. Do I have a broom or something? Okay, I have a little tripod that I could show this with. The weight shift, super important. The way that I feel weight shifting often for myself is toe to toe. And I'm coming out, and then I have to like control a movement this way. The way that the weight should be shifting, and the way that we see Isaac shifting the weight, the way that we'll see Gannon, Niklas, everyone does this to an extent who is a really good thrower. And I think like I kind of do it, but not nearly as consistently or as good as I could be, because the weight shouldn't be shifting this way. It should actually be shifting this way, which feels very counterintuitive, but when you're playing in the mud, it makes a lot of sense. Because if you're toe to toe, then you're going to be a little forward and you're going to be off balance, and it's much easier to slip when you're not creating like a cross or like a stable base for yourself in your own throw. If you're weight shifting this way, then the weight comes from here off the toe, back this way, and now this foot stays really stable on the ground because you're putting the weight from here into this direction. It's not going this way where it's in front of your body. It's actually staying centered to your body. And when you're watching the golfer, he's like this. This is why in the disc golf throw, we have a little slight stagger. Some people do the window thing. I think it's probably best to have the stagger probably closer to this heel on this toe. And then this line kind of becomes a little more here. If you have your toe here and your heel here, the weight gets transferred this way, and that way it can transfer up the kinetic chain from here. Because if it's here, it's not really going to be able to travel this way. This is something that I think will be relatively difficult to change and figure out, something I'm still working on. And if I find good cues for it, or if anyone has good cues for it, definitely let me know. But even just thinking about the weight shift in this way, not being heel to toe or even toe to toe or midfoot to toe, but instead being kind of midfoot or toe to heel, I think it'd be really helpful in just you feeling like you have a more stable base as you're throwing. So if you're struggling with kind of falling over your brace or staying on your toe when you're throwing, thinking about the weight shift that way might be a helpful paradigm for you. But because disc golf is pretty variable, sometimes you're gonna have to adjust this a little bit, even when you're playing in the mud. So here are a couple extra examples of this kind of concept. First, let's look at another great example, which is gonna be Isaac's upshot here. And this becomes especially important because he can't really have his weight go too far forward or his momentum go too far forward because he'll hit his hand on a tree.
Beautifully judged for both of those guys over the top on a gusty, windy.
You could see how it kind of forces his hips kind of backwards as he's throwing it. Watch it again real fast and we'll slow it down. So his weight now is coming from this mid step and it's not going here, because if it was going there, then he would be falling a little more forward. But in order to keep his balance and his center of mass over the throw, his weight's actually having to transfer from this area to kind of his heel. And so he's putting his heel through the ground, and we're able to watch him stay his core, his center, very stacked the whole time, and it just kind of rotate around him. This is another way to think about the brace, the thing that a lot of people in disc golf talk about, but this is how he's able to throw shots like this, where he has a very compact space to do it. He can't afford to lean a little more forward or a little more back, and so making sure that his weight is transferring in a way that keeps his body centered rather than forward is very helpful for him. But this is not always something that in disc golf you have to do or is good, but it should be the standard. This should be the baseline, and then learn this and then deviate from it as you need. And we'll actually see Gannon do this on his upshot here because he needs to throw around something. So if we watch him, you would think that he would be shifting the weight from here, his toe, to his heel area, but instead he's actually shifting a little more forward because of what's in his back. He needs his body to actually be moving forward so that he can overcompensate with his upper body and throw it this way.
So he leaves himself a little further back.
Looks like Gannon's gonna try and use the airspace above as well.
So he's able to manipulate the way that he shifts his weight to be more advantageous for that position. Interesting concept that I've heard talked about in different ways in disc golf, and this is just another way that I've thought about it based on stuff that I'm consuming and learning just being in the gym, and then now seeing people doing it in real time. The more, it's like one of those things, it's like if you're looking for a new car and then you just see that car everywhere, it's the same thing when I watch coverage. I'm learning concepts and then I'm seeing them everywhere, and it's like, well, how did I never see this before? It's like, well, you didn't even know it existed. So it's something that I want to relay on to you, and hopefully it makes sense. This is also a concept for forehands. It's not only a backhand concept, but because you throw both ways in disc golf, we're going to watch Gannon throw here.
Play off of this tee, you sometimes get a nice extra skip to the right. You just don't want to push it too far straight.
And essentially, this is very similar to what I talked about in last week's video with Anthony Barella kind of screwing his feet into the ground. It's because of this weight shift. You can't do that unless you basically shift your weight into that heel or behind that heel, feeling like it's doing that. And that's what kind of grounds your heel there. You have to be strong enough in some muscles to do it, but you can always practice, and your body will adapt to getting closer and closer to that line if you practice it and try to get the feel. If we watch Gannon on the forehand, pretty simply, you're going to see it's not quite the same because obviously the feet are in a very different orientation, but the weight is not shifting just from here straight forward. It has to shift rotationally because that's how torque is created. The weight is not coming straight here. It's actually coming this way behind his heel or into that heel, and he's able to rotate through that and kind of keep that foot straight. That's why he's not going onto his toe. That's why he's able to stay in his heel for this throw. And so these are important concepts for throwing in muddy rounds so that you're not slipping all over the place, because you're keeping your weight kind of inside of your own frame that you're building rather than it being outside of your frame, and that's when slips are much easier to come. So, concept 3, ground play and knowing conditions and being adaptable to the conditions. We're going to go to hole 11 in this first round. And hole 11, as we're seeing, is a 777-foot par 4. It basically wide open field. There's OB lining the right and the left. And so typically with something like this, it's going to be hard ground. It's not long grass. You're going to get a lot of skips. And so I'm sure during practice rounds, it was pretty common for people to be throwing this big wide hyzer that you're going to see Gannon throw here and go right of the OB line and just skip back to the left, or skip just inbounds because this fairway is only 100 or so feet wide. But as we're watching Gannon throw, you see that today, because it's so sodden, it's just sticking in the ground. And so this is a very important thing to know. Like, you're going to have to adjust your aim points based on how the ground is playing differently. If you know that you're going to be getting skips, you're going to probably adjust your aim point 20, 30, 50 feet to the right or to the left, depending on which spin you're throwing. And you're watching Niklas here still be able to do it, but be a little bit close. Unfortunately, James not having the best round today, and he's going to throw a similar shot to I'm sure he practiced all the time, always skip back in bounds. But because it's a different day, and maybe this could just be a slip, it's hard to put everything on whatever. The disc flipped up a little more, but you're not getting that same skip that you normally would, and that's not coming back in bounds. That disc also was on a slightly straighter angle. I think it still would get a lot more skip and probably swing back in bounds. But unfortunately, because of that, he's going to be throwing from 100 feet off the tee rather than 450 feet down the fairway like everybody else is. And so knowing how discs are going to react to the ground, it's important to know that so that you can adjust your shot accordingly and just know kind of not only how the disc is going to fly through the air, but also what it's going to hit on the ground, because you could also hit pretty heavy dirt patches and skip you 50 feet when you landed right next to the basket. And ultimately, that's not probably the best shot. Of course, it's a good looking shot because you landed by the basket. I've had plenty of those shots and it's like, oh, unlucky. It's like, it's not unlucky. I knew that the ground was going to be hard there, or I could have assumed it. I could always play it safer because you have 30 feet on either side of the basket. And so if you're coming in on a hyzer from right to left, if you think that the ground even could be skippy, if you land it 30 feet to the right of the basket, then you have 60 feet where you're still in the circle. Maybe it hits and sits and you're still 30 feet from the basket. Maybe it skips 20 feet because it's not quite as ground as hard as you thought, and you got 10 feet to the basket. Maybe it skips 50 feet and you're still only 20 feet from the basket because you landed it on this side. So knowing the ground play can be pretty important. The one other example I have of this comes from hole 7 in round 2. It's a 453-foot par 4. And if we look at the upshots here, the ground is super sticky. So they're trying to throw this 250-foot shot that I'm sure they practice landing at 20 feet short and sliding up to the basket, which is something I always try to do is if I can't afford to, like if I know it's going to get a little slide, I'd always like to land short of the basket and slide up. For the same reason, I want to skip from the right side of the basket in closer to the basket because you have the highest percentage chance of staying closer to the basket. So it's likely that they're just trying to hit this gap and throw the same shot that they practiced, but it's harder to realize that you need to put a little extra power into it because today you're not getting any ground play.
And full speed forehand. We got Raven going mid range.
Well, somehow Emerson isn't the first to act too. That's kind of blows my mind.
I think he's another 40 feet up. Accidental. It proved kind of nice for him.
These low shots.
Oh yeah.
Just shots that would be 15 feet closer to the basket, absolutely parked. Instead, they're 20 feet. Luckily, I think they all clean up their putts, but just something else to realize. Concept 4 is kind of interesting. It's 3 different ways to throw standstill forehands that I noticed that players were using. And this is honestly one of my observations that if you guys have any thoughts on, I'd be super interested, because one of them is a way that I don't think I've ever seen someone throw before, and it kind of sparked this whole concept for this part of the video. All of these are actually going to be on hole 6 of this same second round, and 2 of them are going to be from Raven Newsom. Unfortunately, back to back, but there's going to be 3 different ways to throw standstill forehands when you're scrambling. So Raven unfortunately gets himself kicked a little bit into the woods, and he has to scramble out. And we're going to see here, this foot is where the mini is. So he's kind of leaning out and throwing in a position where he is that front foot out, bent, and his hips are turned away from the target, using that kind of front foot to put himself in a position where he can brace it and rotate this way. But he needs to throw an anhyzer kind of out here So it's a similar position to the one that we'll watch next, but it's a more traditional way that I have thrown and seen people throw these kind of step out, standstill forehands, where you kind of load onto the back, the front foot is the stability, and then that switches, weight shift if we want to think about it like that, weight shifts into the heel, and you throw.
Travel forward and just get yourself up the fairway for the par. Make sure.
Unfortunate result, good concept. He's also a great player. And then this is the one that I've never seen before, but is super intriguing to me. Watch this shot.
Yeah, a fireball off the tee to get him into that position. That there was a panic off the tree, full flight backwards. And now back to that fireball.
So this shot is so interesting because it's more of like a patent pending forehand. You don't get a great view of it down here, but his front foot is now behind the mini, and his back foot is even more behind him. His hips are very close to the target, and so the rotation that he's going to get is by extending this and kind of swinging this right hip over the front one. I think this is probably because there's not really a step or like a stance here or here, because if he stands out here, then he's moving his whole body this way, and this tree comes into play. And so to hit this gap, he's throwing a forehand that I would say is kind of a patent pending forehand that I've never seen anybody else do before.
Full flight backwards.
You can see the fall through is that whole front hip kind of goes over the front one. So he's standing here like this. And I think in this position it's important he has that front knee semi-bent, because if it's already locked, there's not a lot of rotation you can get. But if it's bent here, then you can use the rotation to lock it as you throw. And he comes in this position and comes over the top and follows through. Super interesting position. Definitely one that I would want to get some practice doing, because I think it's one, I mean, I would try to find another position and probably pinch my line on that tree and just try to not hit it inside the one that I pointed out. But I think this position, you could definitely get enough power. I mean, he's trying to throw a 250-foot shot. And so whatever your 60, 70%, maybe a little less forehand shot is, finding this position where you can kind of be here and throw over it could be interesting. So let me try one. So I definitely see it's easier to early release this shot, which I think is why it's all the more impressive. That he just laces this down most of the first fairway. It's very easy to kind of come out early. And so staying really tight in your core and rotating over that leg and then just following through rather than trying to force it through might be helpful. Kind of more like that. Super interesting shot shape. Definitely something that I want a little more experience on. Now the third standstill forehand, something I'm sure you've probably seen before. But it's Gannon shot directly after this. Much more kind of straight on. Just using a typical load and unload for a very short forehand.
Putting is so good this week.
For sure. See, that's what I'm thinking here. Gannon wasn't too...
So much vocal fry. But one of the things to notice in this forehand is he's kind of loading into this same hinged position. Now, obviously, with a little more rotation, but still hinged here. And then he's getting this leg very strong as he throws. Just kind of rotating forward and then stops the rotation of that leg, of that front hip, as he's throwing this shot. So much more kind of straight on, but not kind of straight on and locked out in your hips. Straight on and somewhat hinged. Because if you're locked out, you're not really rotating much. At least you're not getting a lot of power from this rotation. But if you're straight on and you're a little hinged, so a little bit of a crease kind of here, then you can kind of load into it and then throw. And kind of what I noticed there, which was kind of interesting, was he would kind of rotate this forward and then stop it and then let the arm come through. So it's much more of a motion where the arm is slightly lagging, like a lot of forehands you see him throw. So 3 different ways to throw standstill forehands. Now, let's talk about using shot shaping, and I call it slip momentum. I don't think that's the actual term for it, to your advantage. But basically, choosing the shot shape that might work out the best if you think that you could slip. This is going to go on to the last hole of the tournament. Emerson and Gannon are in a pretty tight battle. Emerson is one back of Gannon going into this hole. We actually aren't going to be talking about kind of who wins, who loses, and whatnot. If you want to learn all about that or you haven't seen it yet, definitely go check out the coverage. But this is going to be about the tee shots on hole 18 and how I think Gannon does a slightly better job of hitting the fairway because he's accounting for how his body could slip if it does. 723 foot par 4. The first shot is a gap shot that you basically just have to hit this gap and you're moving a little bit right in the fairway, but anything in the fairway is good. You're probably going to have a 400 foot to 450 foot shot no matter what. It's going to be difficult. Emerson just needs to hit this gap and make sure that he's in position to get up and down to give himself a chance for birdie. And I actually really like his disc choice here. They're going to talk about it here in a second.
I like the chances for the birdie if you get to the fairway. Footing gets maybe a little bit better after that. Anywhere around that tee pad, you're going to have some funky footing.
Oh, just soft from Emerson. That was a
And
Valkyrie.
it sticks.
So he threw a Valkyrie there, which is 9.5 negative 2.2, I believe. Slightly understable 9 speed. I actually really like that choice because he knows that he's having to throw slower. And so when you're having to throw slower, if you throw flippier, even if it's like, this is way more understable than an ever forehand. I've never heard of him forehanding a Valkyrie before. Maybe he does, typically. But I'd imagine this is the type of shot that he'd throw like a seasoned-in Firebird with, typically, if he has a full run-up, because you can just still smooth that. But if you think you could slip, I really like that disc choice. However, the shot shape, I think is fine, but the way that kind of this forehand works, compared to how Gannon is about to throw his, makes it slightly disadvantageous in my opinion. I think throwing a slight flex down this fairway where it's moving away from this first tree cluster and then later moving away from this far tree might be a slightly better shot because it goes with your slip. And this is what I'm going to talk about. I don't think he slips here, but it could be something that's easily in your head, especially you're in a tight battle for a tournament. And the way that the forehand shot here works on hyzer
Around that
is the shoulder slightly drops as you throw it. So right here, he's in a very similar position that we'll see from Gannon in a second. But to throw this shot, the shoulder actually comes down and is like, if this is your neck and like you have traps here and then your shoulder, it's coming slightly more down so that he can throw this hyzer angle out of his hand. The shot is great. It's just pulled a little bit to the right, but his body is going this way and the shot is going this way. Whereas what we're going to see with Gannon here is the flex forehand.
This is the conservative play here. Hammering over on that glow FD3.
All we're taking a look at is the shoulder positioning, because the shoulder is in a very similar position to where Emerson was when I clocked it a second ago, but the shoulder stays high, which means that as he's kind of falling away from the shot, the shoulder is kind of coming around with him. So if he's moving his body to the left, because that's the direction that he'd likely slip if he was to slip, and just because his body is moving that way, as he's moving this way, the forehand is kind of, the anhyzer's coming with him and getting pulled a little more left, which I think is a slightly better miss if he was to miss this shot. And so throwing the flex out here, especially when it's slippy, and just making sure you're chopping it over on that angle, you're still throwing slower. So he's throwing still an overstable disc, but not his most overstable disc, making sure that he's like he gets a little more glide out of that than he does like a splice, or I think he probably has a slightly more overstable FD3 if I remember from his bag, maybe like his Doombird 4 run. But I think the difference in those two forehands and the shot shapes are that the anhyzer's slightly safer because as you're throwing the hyzer, when you throw the forehand, the shoulder is just slightly lower in the arm slot here as you throw a smooth hyzer versus when you're throwing an anhyzer, your shoulder's just ever so slightly higher, meaning that as you're coming around the shot, the shoulder stays with you a little bit more as you punch the anhyzer through. The hyzer comes out slightly earlier, and the anhyzer stays with you slightly more. This is just my understanding, and I mean, obviously all this is, so take it for what it's worth, but I think as you're playing in muddy conditions and like terrible stuff, or maybe even just rainy, if you have a shot where you can choose between the hyzer flip or the anhyzer on the forehand, I think the anhyzer is a slightly safer option because you just stay a little taller and your shoulders kind of stay with you a little more than the hyzer does, as it's kind of more of a down to up motion, whereas this is kind of a straight on motion and just keeping the similar arm slot. Because you notice Emerson's arm angle was very similar. It was just down, and then it kind of came through on hyzer. Very similar to Gannon's arm angle for a while. He was just able to keep that arm angle more, which to me shows there's slightly more shoulder congruency throwing that anhyzer than throwing the hyzer. So those are my main thoughts from the Cancer Playbook Open. I hope you guys enjoyed. Let me know still more feedback. This is definitely a series I'm wanting to refine. I'm giving it 5 good goes at least. I would love to do it for every event. I feel like I learn a lot, and it helps me to kind of, teaching always helps you to learn more, and so just me being able to present this information and package it together. Hopefully this was a better format than just like finding 10 shots. It was hard with this coverage because there's a lot of the same people. I like getting a more variety, and hopefully I'm able to find more concepts and maybe even condense the time, but you guys know me. I'm a little bit of a yapper, so subscribe if you'd like. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys tomorrow for one of my favorite videos I've shot in a while, and then hopefully next week for Waco. So good luck to everyone playing. Go check out GoThrow's coverage if you want, and I'll see you guys soon. Peace.